The sun hung low in the evening sky, casting a golden glow over the quiet suburban streets. Officer Mark Reynolds adjusted his sunglasses, taking a slow sip of his lukewarm coffee as he patrolled his usual route. It was supposed to be a routine shift, a few speeding tickets, maybe a minor disturbance. Nothing out of the ordinary. But fate had other plans. As he drove past an old gas station, his trained eyes caught sight of a red sedan swerving slightly before regaining control. The driver, a middle-aged man in a white button-down shirt, kept glancing at his rearview mirror, his fingers gripping the steering wheel too tightly. Something about his body language sent an alarm through Mark's instincts. Years on the force had taught him one thing. When a driver looks that nervous, they're either hiding something or running from something. Flipping on his lights, he signaled for the car to pull over. The red sedan slowed, rolling onto the side of the road. Mark parked behind it, stepping out cautiously, one hand near his holster. The summer heat pressed against his skin, but an eerie chill crawled up his spine. Something felt off. As he approached the driver's window, the man inside forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Evening, officer." "Something wrong?" "License and registration," Mark said, keeping his tone neutral. The man hesitated, a fraction of a second too long, before reaching into the glove compartment. Mark observed him closely, noting the beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the car's blasting air conditioning. "You swerved back there," Mark continued, his gaze shifting to the back seat. "Everything all right?" The man's jaw tightened. "Yeah, just tired." Mark nodded, but something inside him screamed that this was more than fatigue. Then he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a faint mew. His pulse quickened. He leaned slightly to the side, peering into the back seat. There, nestled in a small, tattered blanket, was a tiny kitten. Its fur was dirty, matted, and it trembled as if it had been through hell. But that wasn't what made Mark's stomach drop. It was the collar around its fragile neck. A collar with a small, rusted tag. A tag that bore a name he hadn't seen in over a decade. The name of his little sister. A cold, suffocating wave of dread washed over him. His fingers clenched around his notepad as his breath caught in his throat. "Where did you get that, kitten?" His voice was sharp now, no longer the polite tone of a routine stop. The man blinked, caught off guard. "What?" Mark's mind raced back to 15 years ago, to a stormy night filled with flashing sirens, desperate cries, and the sound of his mother's screams. His sister, Emily, had vanished without a trace. The only thing left behind was her favorite kitten, Snowball, who had the same type of collar, the same rusted tag. That collar had been buried with Snowball, and now, staring back at him, was an identical one. "Step out of the car," Mark ordered, his voice steady but laced with ice. The man hesitated. "Look, officer, it's just a stray. I found it near." "Step out. Now." There was no room for argument. The man slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. Mark's heart pounded as he reached for his radio, calling in for backup. Every fiber of his being screamed that this was no coincidence. The kitten let out another weak mew, its tiny paws stretching toward him as if recognizing something, someone. Mark's hands shook as he carefully reached inside and picked up the fragile creature. Its eyes, a piercing shade of green, locked onto his. An overwhelming sense of familiarity flooded him, a long-buried memory clawing its way to the surface. Emily's giggles, her small hands clutching a tiny kitten to her chest. The way she used to say, "Snowball will always protect me." His vision blurred. "Where did you get this kitten?" he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. The man swallowed hard, his gaze darting around as if searching for an escape. I don't know what you think is happening here, but Mark had heard enough. Within seconds, he had the man in cuffs, pressing him against the hood of the car. "You're under arrest for possible involvement in a cold case investigation," he said, his voice firm despite the storm raging inside him. The man started to protest, but Mark had already tuned him out. His focus was on the kitten, on the rusted tag, on the undeniable feeling that someone was reaching out to him from beyond the years. His backup arrived minutes later, securing the scene as Mark sat in his squad car, cradling the tiny kitten in his arms. It purred weakly, nuzzling into his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt something shift inside him. Hope. By the time they ran the man's record, the truth unraveled like a nightmare come to life. The driver, James Holloway, had been on the police radar before, suspected in multiple missing persons cases but never caught. He had ties to a human trafficking ring that had been operating under the radar for years, and one of his earliest known victims had been a little girl named Emily Reynolds. Mark sat in stunned silence as the pieces fell into place. The kitten, found in the trunk alongside old, faded photographs, had been a lure, a message, or maybe a sign. His sister's case had never been solved. But now, after all these years, a single moment, a single traffic stop, had cracked open the past. His face was pale as he looked at the tiny creature in his hands. It had led him straight to the man who might hold the answers he had been searching for his entire life. As the red and blue lights flashed around him, Mark whispered, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "I found you, Emily." And for the first time since that stormy night 15 years ago, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of the end of his search. A single tear slipped down his cheek as the kitten curled deeper into his arms. Somewhere, somehow, he knew Emily was watching. The precinct was eerily quiet that night, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Officer Mark Reynolds sat at his desk, staring at the rusted collar tag in his hand. The kitten, now resting in a small box lined with an old sweatshirt, purred softly beside him. His fingers trembled as he traced the engraved letters, Emily, his sister's name. The weight of the past bore down on him like a tidal wave. James Holloway, the man arrested during the traffic stop, was sitting in an interrogation room down the hall, his hands cuffed to the table. Mark had watched him through the one-way glass, analyzing every twitch, every nervous glance. Holloway wasn't just a liar. He was hiding something. Something big. The door to the office creaked open, and Captain Harris stepped inside, a thick file in hand. The older man's face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes held the same fire Mark felt burning in his own chest. "You were right to stop that car," Harris said, dropping the file onto the desk. "Holloway's got a record longer than Route 66. Smuggling, fraud, and now," his voice trailed off. Mark flipped open the file, his breath catching in his throat. Inside were reports of missing persons. Children, women, people who had seemingly vanished without a trace. But then he saw it. A single, grainy photograph buried beneath the stack of reports. A girl. Long, dark hair. A shy, hesitant smile. His sister, Emily. The picture was old, taken at least a decade ago, but there was no mistaking it. Mark's vision blurred, his grip tightening on the paper. "We found this in Holloway's trunk," Harris continued, along with several other photos, some of them recent. Mark's pulse thundered in his ears. Recent. That meant Emily. That meant Emily might still be alive. Mark's entire world tilted. His sister had been missing for over 10 years. The night she disappeared had haunted him every single day since. He had been only 17, too young, too helpless to stop it. And now there was proof that she had still been out there, at least recently. His hands shook as he ran his fingers over the grainy photograph. "Where exactly did you find this?" His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "In a hidden compartment in the trunk," Captain Harris said. "And that's not all." He pulled another object from the file and placed it on the desk. A small, folded piece of paper. Mark unfolded it with trembling hands. Inside, scrawled in frantic, uneven handwriting, were the words, "Help me. I'm still alive." A chill ran down Mark's spine. His breathing grew shallow. He swallowed hard, his mind racing. He looked back at the interrogation room where Holloway sat, staring at the table, his jaw set in tight defiance. Mark clenched his fists. This man had answers. Without another word, he pushed back his chair, stormed down the hallway, and threw open the door to the interrogation room. Holloway barely flinched. He just smirked. Mark slammed the photograph down in front of him. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice shaking with fury. Holloway leaned back in his chair, looking at the picture as if it were meaningless. "I don't know what you're talking about." Mark's patience snapped. He grabbed Holloway by the collar, pulling him forward until their faces were inches apart. That kitten in your car wasn't just a stray, was it? It led me straight to this. That tag, it has my sister's name on it. You know something? For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Holloway's face. He licked his lips. I don't. Mark shoved him back into the chair. Talk. Now. Holloway let out a slow exhale and glanced at the one-way mirror, as if weighing his options. Then finally he spoke. She's alive, he said quietly. But if you don't act fast, she won't be for long. Mark's heart pounded. Where? Holloway hesitated, then muttered, a farmhouse. About 50 miles from here. It's where they keep the ones they don't want to be found. Mark felt his blood turn to ice. Who's they? Holloway leaned in, his smirk returning. You're in over your head, officer. If you go after them alone, you won't come back. Mark didn't care. He had spent the last decade regretting the night he lost his sister. Now he had a chance to make things right. He turned to Captain Harris. We need a team. Now! Harris nodded. I'll get everyone ready. Mark took one last look at the kitten, still curled up in its box. It had led him to the truth. Now he was going to follow it straight into the darkness. And this time, he wasn't going to lose. The farmhouse of secrets. Mark barely had time to breathe as the SWAT team assembled. Every moment counted. If Emily was still alive, she was running out of time. The farmhouse was deep in the countryside, surrounded by nothing but endless fields and decaying barns. The dirt road leading to it was barely visible on the map, but Holloway's directions were clear. Mark gripped the steering wheel as he sped down the deserted highway, his heart pounding. Beside him, Captain Harris loaded his rifle. If Holloway's lying. He's not, Mark said firmly. He had seen the flicker of fear in Holloway's eyes. He was terrified of whoever was running this operation. As they approached, the farmhouse came into view, a rundown, two-story building with boarded-up windows and a crumbling porch. But Mark knew better than to be fooled by its appearance. Beneath its decayed exterior, it held something much darker. The SWAT team moved in silently, surrounding the house. Mark's pulse quickened. This is it. Harris gave the signal. Crash. The front door burst open. Police! Hands up! Silence. The team moved quickly, sweeping room by room. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he pushed deeper inside. The place was eerily empty. Too empty. Something was off. Then, a muffled cry. Mark's stomach clenched. Emily. He sprinted toward the sound, kicking open a locked door in the hallway. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a set of stairs leading underground. A basement. He didn't hesitate. He bolted down the steps and froze. Cages. Dozens of cages lined the basement walls, filled with terrified animals, kittens, dogs, even rabbits. Some were malnourished, others injured. This wasn't just a hideout, it was a trafficking operation. And in the center of the room, a woman, chained to the wall. Weak but alive. Emily. Her sunken eyes widened when she saw him. Mark. Her voice was barely a whisper. Mark's breath caught. Emily. But before he could move, a gunshot rang out. A figure stepped from the shadows. Mark turned sharply, raising his weapon, and locked eyes with the last person he ever expected. The final confrontation. Mark's heart pounded as he stared at the figure emerging from the shadows. Chief Matthews, his own boss, the man who had trained him, guided him, stood before him with a gun, his face void of remorse. Mark, Matthews said coolly, stepping closer. I warned you to let this go. Mark clenched his jaw, gripping his weapon tighter. You're behind this? Matthews exhaled, almost disappointed. I didn't want you involved, but you just couldn't stop digging. Mark's stomach churned. The corruption ran higher than he ever imagined. You did all of this, for what? Money? Matthews smirked. Power. Connections. The underground trade isn't just about money, Mark. It's control. People like Holloway? They work for people like me. People who actually run things. Mark's grip on the trigger tightened. You're disgusting. Matthews sighed, raising his gun. And you're in the way. Bang! The gunshot echoed through the basement. For a split second, Mark thought he'd been hit. But then, Matthew staggered. A dark red stain spread across his chest. His gun slipped from his fingers as he collapsed to the ground. Behind him stood Captain Harris, rifle smoking. "I never liked that guy," Harris muttered. Mark exhaled, relief washing over him. But there was no time to waste. He rushed to Emily, unlocking her chains. She fell into his arms, weak but alive. "It's over," he whispered. "You're safe." Tears streamed down Emily's face as she clung to him. The moment was brief, because the SWAT team was already securing the rest of the basement, rescuing the terrified animals. And in the very last cage, shivering and afraid, was the tiny kitten that had started it all. Mark gently picked up the little creature, cradling it in his hands. The kitten let out a soft, weak meow, curling into his warmth. "It's okay," he murmured. "You're safe now." Epilogue. A bittersweet ending. The following days were a whirlwind. The farmhouse bust led to dozens of arrests, uncovering a massive trafficking ring that had operated for years. Holloway turned witness, exposing every name connected to the operation. Matthew's betrayal shook the entire police department, but in the end, justice prevailed. Emily, after days of recovery, finally returned home, but things would never be the same. She had endured hell, and while her wounds would heal, the scars would remain. Mark visited her every day, bringing food, checking in. He didn't say much, he didn't need to. His presence was enough. And as for the kitten, Mark adopted her. He named her Hope, because in the darkest of places, even when all seemed lost, hope had found a way. And sometimes, the smallest lives could change everything. The end.